Grayson Holt thought he was just touring another hospital for a corporate charity, until a 5-year-old girl pointed at the pendant on his chest and said, "Mom, that's yours." Grayson Holt had walked through hundreds of hospitals over the years, shaking hands with CEOs during funding meetings, cutting ribbons at pediatric wings bearing his company's logo, visiting research labs his foundation quietly supported. But he had never been in one like this. It wasn't grand or state-of-the-art. It was an older facility on the edge of the city, worn but clean, the walls painted in muted tones that tried to calm more than impress. His company was sponsoring a renovation of the children's wing, and though he usually sent someone else in his place, today he had decided to come himself. Why, he couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was the sleepless night. Maybe it was the feeling that had been haunting him lately, that something in his life, despite all the money and status, was incomplete. He wore a light blue suit, neatly pressed, and beneath his shirt, resting just over his heart, was the same pendant he had worn every day for 5.5 years. Half a heart, sterling silver, dulled slightly by time. The other half, he assumed, was gone forever, left with the woman who once wore it like it meant everything. He hadn't said her name in years. Avery. Just thinking it made something tighten in his chest. He had loved her once, deeply, foolishly, recklessly. And then he left. At the time, it made sense. He wasn't ready. He had a company to build, a future to chase, and she needed more than he thought he could give. So he walked away, and she didn't stop him. They hadn't spoken since. Now he stood in the main hallway of the hospital, nodding politely to a nurse giving him a tour, his thoughts elsewhere, when a small voice pierced the air. "Mom, that's your necklace." It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Instinct made him turn toward the voice. And then he saw her. The girl couldn't have been older than 5. She had brown eyes so deep and wide they almost swallowed the room, and her hair was the same soft chestnut that haunted his memories. She wore a pink t-shirt and a denim skirt and held a half-melted lollipop in one hand. But he wasn't looking at the candy. He was looking at her face. It was like staring into the past, his past. Her gaze was fixed not on him, but on the small pendant at the base of his throat, which had slipped slightly outside his collar. Grayson's heart dropped. He reached up, instinctively covering the pendant, but it was too late. The little girl turned to the woman beside her and tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, that's the same one you have." He followed the girl's motion, and then he saw her. Seated in a wheelchair, draped in a light blanket, was Avery. Her hair was thinner, and her face more fragile, but her green eyes still burned with that quiet, fierce intensity. She looked up slowly, and when her eyes met his, the world around them stopped. Neither of them moved. For a moment it was as if the past had collapsed into the present and everything that had ever been unsaid filled the space between them like static. Avery's eyes flicked briefly to the pendant around his neck, then to her own. Hanging on a thin chain just visible beneath her hospital gown was the matching half-heart. They had each held on to their piece, never knowing the other had done the same. The nurse began saying something beside him, but Grayson didn't hear it. His legs moved on their own. Step by step, he crossed the floor, until he was standing directly in front of her. She looked up at him, emotion flashing behind tired eyes, and then she gave the smallest, saddest smile he'd ever seen. "You came," she said, her voice dry but steady. He couldn't find his voice at first. He looked down at the little girl, her daughter, and then back at Avery. "Is she," he began, but the words felt too big. Avery nodded. "Her name is Rose." Grayson's breath caught in his throat. The pendant on his chest suddenly felt heavier. "She's mine," he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Avery didn't speak, but she didn't deny it. And in that silence, the truth filled every corner of his soul. Grayson Holt had come to the hospital to check on a donation. Instead, he had found the life he never knew he left behind. Grayson didn't remember walking to the nearest bench in the hallway, but suddenly he was sitting, elbows on his knees, his thoughts spinning so fast they barely held form. Across from him, Avery sat quietly in her wheelchair, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her expression unreadable but her eyes fixed on him with a level of calm that only someone used to pain could maintain. Between them stood Rose, bouncing slightly on her heels, unaware of the full gravity of the moment but sensing its importance. She held a small stuffed rabbit in one hand and studied Grayson's face with the wide-eyed curiosity that only a child who hadn't yet learned to fear the answers could carry. He stared at her. Everything in her face was familiar, the slope of her nose, the shape of her lips, the slight crease between her brows that matched his exactly when she frowned. He knew it without question. This was his daughter. Avery broke the silence first, her voice quieter than he remembered, more fragile. "I was going to tell you." Her hands tightened for a moment. "At first, I didn't know how. Then I thought maybe you'd find out on your own. After a while, I convinced myself it didn't matter if you knew. I told myself I didn't want to interrupt your life. You had made your choice." Grayson lifted his head, swallowing the rising guilt that pressed against his chest. "Avery, I didn't know you were pregnant." If I had, but he didn't finish the sentence, because the truth was he didn't know what he would have done. Back then, he had believed he was doing the right thing, walking away from something good before he ruined it. He had convinced himself she was better off without someone like him. But seeing her now, looking exhausted and thinner, and knowing she had gone through all of this alone, it shattered every justification he'd built for leaving. She nodded slightly, as if reading his thoughts. "I don't blame you. I did, for a long time, but not anymore. We both made choices. We both lived with them." Grayson looked down at Rose, who had now wandered over to a vending machine a few steps away, her tiny fingers pressed against the glass as she eyed a pack of crackers. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "She's amazing." Avery smiled faintly. "She's stubborn like you. Brave like her grandmother. Talks too much like me." Grayson couldn't help but laugh at that, a short breath of sound filled with disbelief and ache. "She doesn't even know who I am, does she?" "No," Avery replied. "She knows she has a dad somewhere. I just didn't have the words to explain why he wasn't here." She paused. "I didn't want her to hate someone she'd never met." He rubbed a hand down his face, trying to absorb everything. "What's wrong with you?" he asked after a long moment. "I mean, why are you here?" The shift in Avery's expression was subtle but unmistakable. She looked away. "Lymphoma," she said. "Stage 3. I'm responding to treatment, but it's been a fight. I started getting sick about a year ago, but I ignored the signs for months. I didn't want to believe it was serious." She looked at him again, softer now. "When they admitted me here full-time, I thought about calling you. Really, I did. But part of me was still angry, or maybe just afraid." He felt like he was suffocating under the weight of everything she was telling him. "And Rose? Who's been taking care of her?" "The nurses help when they can. Maggie, my nurse, has been like family. But mostly, Rose stays here with me. I couldn't bear to send her to foster care or to some stranger. She's too little." The thought of Rose sleeping in hospital chairs, of her watching her mother hooked up to IVs, of her learning to be silent when nurses passed by, twisted something deep in Grayson's gut. He hadn't just missed her first steps or her first words. He had missed her fear. Her resilience. Her whole beginning. He stood slowly and crossed the small space between them. "Let me help. Please, Avery. I don't care how we got here. I want to do right by her. And by you." She didn't answer right away. She studied him, carefully, as if trying to decide if this version of Grayson was the same man who had walked out 5.5 years ago. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe time and regret and absence had stripped away the arrogance. Or maybe he had simply grown up the moment he heard a child call her Mom. After a long pause, Avery nodded. Okay. You can start by getting her that snack she's staring at before she shakes the whole machine. It was so simple, and so heartbreakingly human. Grayson turned and walked to the vending machine, feeding in coins with shaking hands, and when he handed Rose the crackers, she beamed at him with a smile so bright it almost undid him. He crouched to her level and said, "I'm Grayson. You can call me Gray, or whatever you want." Rose studied him for a second, then took the crackers. "Okay," she said casually. "You look like someone who likes rules." "I don't." He laughed again, tears stinging his eyes. "We'll figure it out." And for the first time in years, he wasn't talking about business. He was talking about life. About something real. Something precious. Something he would never walk away from again. Grayson returned to the hospital the next morning, earlier than expected, carrying a small paper bag from the local bookstore down the street and 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with cream, just the way Avery used to drink it. He hadn't called ahead or texted. Part of him feared she might tell him not to come. But the bigger part of him needed to see her again, needed to see Rose. He had spent the entire night in a daze, lying awake in his penthouse where everything was perfectly silent and completely wrong. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something that actually mattered, something he couldn't buy or outmaneuver, something fragile and real. The realization was both terrifying and grounding. He knew he had missed out on her early years, on bedtime stories, on first birthdays, on comforting cries he didn't know had happened, but he also knew he had been given a second chance, and there was no version of this life now where he would let it slip by. When he entered Avery's hospital room, it was dim and quiet, the morning sun casting soft light through the blinds. Rose was curled up next to her mother on the narrow bed, asleep with her cheek resting against Avery's arm. Avery was awake, propped against a pillow, reading a book with one hand and gently running her fingers through Rose's hair with the other. She looked up when she saw him, surprised but not startled, and a faint smile passed across her lips. She looked exhausted but steadier today, her eyes a little clearer, her skin slightly less pale. She nodded toward the coffee in his hand. "Is that peace offering or bribery?" Grayson smiled and handed her the one with cream. "Maybe both. I didn't want to wait another day. I didn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about everything. About her. About you. About all the things I never did and how I want to start doing them now." Avery took the cup, wrapping her hands around it slowly, as if warming them more from the gesture than the heat. "It's strange seeing you here," she said quietly. "I used to imagine what it would feel like, you walking back into my life. I never pictured this setting." Grayson lowered himself into the chair beside the bed. "Neither did I. But maybe this is exactly what it needed to be. Something that strips away all the noise." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at Rose, still sleeping peacefully. "She's been so strong through all of this. She asks questions I can't always answer. Sometimes I think she knows more than she lets on." Grayson followed her gaze. "She's sharp. And she's brave. She called me out yesterday without even blinking." "She does that," Avery said, her voice softening. "You know, she's never really had a stable male figure around. I didn't want to bring men in and out of her life just to fill a space. I didn't want her to see love as something temporary or replaceable." Grayson shifted, his tone quiet. "I'm not temporary." Avery studied him again. She seemed to be searching for cracks, for hesitation, for signs that this was guilt or charity or fear. But what she saw was different. He wasn't the man who had walked away years ago. There was no arrogance in his posture now, no distance in his eyes. Only something slower, heavier, something that looked like resolve. I want to take care of both of you, he said. I want to help with treatment, move you somewhere better, get Rose in a proper routine. I know you don't need saving. You've done an incredible job. But I want to be here, not just visiting. Really here. Avery exhaled slowly. It's not going to be easy. She'll ask you hard questions. And I'll have days where I can't get out of bed. I know, he said simply. And I'll be there anyway. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of machines and faint hallway footsteps filling the space around them. Then Rose stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked at Grayson sitting in the chair beside her mother. Are you still here? She asked sleepily, rubbing her eyes. I am, he said with a small smile. I brought you something. He reached into the bag and pulled out a small, hardcover children's book, a story about a brave rabbit who crossed a forest to find his way back home. Rose sat up, curiosity instantly lit behind her eyes. She took the book, turned it over in her hands, and glanced at him. You picked this? I did, he said. I thought maybe I could read it to you later. She leaned into Avery and clutched the book to her chest. Okay. But you have to do the voices. He laughed, the sound surprised out of him. Deal. Avery looked at them both, her daughter snuggled against her side, Grayson sitting across from her, gently folding his tie into his coat pocket as if even that formality felt too distant now, and something shifted in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the start of trust. The beginning of something that might, if nurtured carefully, become whole again. And so the morning passed, quiet and steady. With one book. One warm cup. One unexpected reunion. And a little girl who had no idea she was stitching together a family that had once been torn apart by silence. The days that followed unfolded with an almost surreal calmness. Grayson returned to the hospital each morning, no longer wearing his suit jackets, opting instead for soft sweaters and rolled-up sleeves that made him look less like a CEO and more like a father slowly learning how to exist in a space he'd never planned for. He brought books, puzzles, snacks, and small surprises for Rose, never anything extravagant, just the kinds of things a father might bring after learning what his child liked by paying attention. He noticed quickly that she loved animals, especially rabbits, and would sit for long stretches drawing detailed versions of them in the corners of her notebooks. One day, he brought her a watercolor set, and she surprised him by painting not a rabbit, but him. It was a crooked figure with a wide smile and large glasses that she insisted he wore, even though he didn't. He laughed so hard that Avery looked up from her chair and smiled at the sound, a smile that carried the weight of too many months lived in silence. By the third day, Grayson had met Maggie, the nurse Avery often spoke about. Maggie was brisk but kind, and she didn't hide her skepticism. When Grayson offered to cover some of the private treatment options, Maggie cornered him outside the room. She's proud, she said. You may have all the money in the world, but if you want to help her, do it with your presence, not your wallet. Her words stuck with him. He shifted his approach. He stopped asking permission to fix things and started listening instead. He sat beside Avery during treatments, sometimes saying nothing at all. He held Rose's hand while she slept in the chair beside her mother. He was learning, painfully and slowly, what it meant to show up. One afternoon, as the light outside turned soft and golden, Grayson arrived to find Avery in the hospital garden. It was a small space tucked between two wings of the building, with just enough sunlight and wind to feel like the world outside still existed. Avery was wrapped in a blanket, seated on a bench, a scarf around her head where her hair had once fallen in dark waves. Rose was sitting at her feet, picking tiny wildflowers from the grass and carefully braiding them together. Grayson paused a moment before joining them, struck by the quiet beauty of the scene. When he sat down beside Avery, she didn't look at him at first. I forgot what it felt like to breathe fresh air, she said. Even if it's just hospital garden air. It still feels like freedom. He nodded, his hands resting between his knees. I could bring you here every day, if you'd like. Just for a bit of peace. She glanced sideways at him, her green eyes sharp. I'm not used to this. You being here. It's good. But strange. I know, he replied. It's strange for me too. But I want it to feel less strange. I want it to feel normal. Avery looked away, her voice quieter now. I spent so many nights wondering if I made the right choice, keeping Rose to myself. I don't regret having her, not for a second. But I was so afraid you wouldn't want her. Or me. Or the life we could have had. Grayson leaned closer, his voice low but firm. You did what you thought was right. And maybe I wasn't ready back then. But I am now. I want to be part of her life. Of yours. Whatever you'll let me be. There was a long pause. Wind moved through the trees, and the rustling leaves filled the silence between them. Finally, she turned her head and looked at him, really looked. You missed everything. Her first steps. Her first word. Her first fever. You weren't there. I know, he said, the words weighted with regret. But I want to be there now. For everything else. For her first day of school. For when she loses her first tooth. For the hard nights and the good mornings. I want to earn it, Avery. Every day, if I have to. She nodded slowly, and for the first time, she didn't look like she was carrying the entire world alone. That evening, Rose ran to him with her flower braid and said, It's for Mom. But you can help me tie it. As he knelt and gently tied the delicate chain of wildflowers around Avery's wrist, something shifted between them. No forgiveness was spoken, no promises made. But there was trust in the quiet. A thread being slowly, carefully rewoven, not just between two adults, but between a man and the life he never knew he'd been missing. The call came late in the evening, just as Grayson was returning to his apartment after a long day at the office and the hospital. He had barely taken off his coat when his phone buzzed, Maggie's name glowing on the screen. Her voice was calm but direct. Avery had collapsed unexpectedly during her treatment. There was internal bleeding. The doctors were doing everything they could, but it was serious. He was already back in his car before the call ended, heart pounding as he raced through the city streets. The sharp contrast between the polished silence of his penthouse and the sterile chaos of the hospital corridor had never felt so cruel. When he arrived, the hallway outside Avery's room was quiet, dimly lit. Maggie met him at the door. She looked tired, her scrubs wrinkled and her hair pulled back in a messy bun, but her eyes were clear. She's stable for now, she said. But it was close. Too close. Grayson didn't speak. He only nodded, then stepped inside the room. The air was heavy with the hum of machines, the quiet beep of monitors keeping time with each heartbeat. Avery lay in bed, pale and unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked smaller than usual, her body lost beneath the layers of blankets and 4 lines. Rose sat curled in a nearby chair, hugging the same worn stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide and unblinking. Grayson walked over, crouched beside her, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Hey, he said softly. I'm here. Rose didn't cry. She simply leaned into him, resting her head against his chest in a way that spoke of complete exhaustion. He wrapped his arms around her and held her for a long time. Later, when she finally dozed off, he carried her to the little couch by the window and tucked a blanket over her. Then he sat beside Avery's bed and took her hand. It felt cold. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if she could hear him, but the words came anyway. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered. You've carried this alone for too long. I should have been here. I'm sorry for every day I wasn't. But I'm here now. And I'm going to stay, no matter what. The hours passed slowly. Nurses came and went, adjusting fluids and monitors, checking vitals. Grayson didn't leave her side. He stayed awake through the night, his hand still around hers, watching the rise and fall of her chest like it was the only thing that mattered. He thought of all the times he had turned away from emotion, buried himself in work, in control, in silence. But this was something different. This was helplessness and hope intertwined. This was love, not in words or grand gestures, but in the simple, quiet act of staying. By morning, Avery stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. Her gaze was glassy at first, unfocused. But then she saw him, saw his face leaning over hers, and the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "You're still here," she rasped. Grayson swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Of course I'm here. I thought I dreamed it," she murmured. "You, holding my hand." "It wasn't a dream," he said. "It's real. I'm not letting go." Tears filled her eyes, though they didn't fall. "I'm scared," she admitted. "For her. For me." "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "But we're going to fight this. Together." Later that day, when the doctor came in to discuss the treatment options, Grayson was ready. He had already called in specialists, arranged consultations, and started the process for an emergency transfer to a top oncology center. Avery protested weakly at first, her voice hoarse with worry. "You don't have to." He cut her off gently but firmly. "Yes, I do. And not because I have to. Because I want to. You're not alone in this anymore." By that evening, arrangements were underway. Rose sat in Grayson's lap, quietly drawing with crayons as Avery slept, and the soft light from the setting sun painted the room in gold. For the first time in a long while, there was a sliver of hope, thin but unshakable. Grayson didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, he would not let go of this family he had almost lost before he even knew it existed. And now that he had them, he would move mountains to keep them. The transition to the new medical facility happened faster than anyone expected. Within 48 hours, Avery was carefully transferred by private medical transport to a leading oncology center outside the city, a place Grayson had pulled strings to access, even calling in favors he hadn't touched in years. He made sure she had her own room with space for Rose to stay, a private nurse, and a view of the hills beyond the hospital grounds. It wasn't opulent, but it was calm, filled with sunlight and quiet corners. Avery was too weak at first to say much about it, but he saw the way her fingers gripped the edge of the sheets when she looked out the window, like she was holding on to something again, something that felt possible. Grayson stayed at a nearby inn, checking in on her every morning and returning each evening with something for Rose: a new book, a sketchpad, a small box of strawberry-flavored granola bars that he'd remembered she liked. Every afternoon, when Avery napped, he and Rose would walk the grounds. She liked to collect leaves and rocks, giving them names and backstories that always made him laugh. She talked about her mother constantly, stories of bedtime songs and silly dances, about days when she was too sick to smile but tried anyway, about nights when she would whisper promises that everything would be okay. Grayson listened, absorbing every detail, because he had missed so much and because these stories were tiny fragments of Avery he had never known. They were both learning who she was from different angles, and in that strange intersection, something unspoken bloomed between father and daughter. In the evenings, they would sit together as a trio. Grayson reading, Avery resting, Rose tucked between them with a blanket draped over her knees. These quiet, routine moments began to form something new, a life not dictated by the past or what had been lost, but by what they could still create. And Grayson, once terrified of permanence, began to crave it. He found himself checking on Rose's school options, speaking with a local therapist about helping her transition, and, more than once, imagining what it would be like to have them both in his home full-time. One night, while Avery was asleep, Rose crawled into Grayson's lap and whispered, "Do you think Mom's going to be okay?" The question broke him in a way no lawsuit, no scandal, no corporate betrayal ever had. He didn't lie. He held her close and said, "I don't know. But I know she's strong. And I know we're going to be right here no matter what." She nodded slowly and rested her head against his chest. When he looked down, he saw her small fingers gripping his shirt in her sleep. He didn't move for a long time. The following morning, something shifted. Avery was stronger. Her appetite returned slightly. Her voice carried a little more weight. Grayson noticed the color returning to her face, a spark returning to her gaze. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but Grayson didn't care about timelines or numbers. He only cared that she was fighting, and winning, even if only in inches. That afternoon, Avery asked for her journal. It was leather-bound, worn at the corners, something she had kept even during her hardest days. Grayson watched as she flipped through it slowly, stopping at one page, her fingers tracing the handwriting. Without speaking, she handed it to him. On the page was a note she had written months ago. It read, "If I don't make it, tell him thank you. And that I never stopped loving him. Even when he broke me." Grayson's hands trembled slightly as he read the words. He looked up at her, but she didn't need to explain. Instead, she reached out, resting her hand over his. "You didn't know," she said. "But you're here now." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For all of it. I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "I just didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to tell you." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in the hush of a quiet hospital room, as the late sun lit the windows in gold. There was no need for more words. There was only time, time that had once been stolen, but was now being given back in the smallest, most powerful ways. Grayson knew the road ahead was still uncertain. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he did know this: whatever happened, he was no longer watching life from the outside. He was living it. With her. With their daughter. And whatever storms came, he was ready to face them, not alone, but together. The winter arrived slowly that year, as if reluctant to disturb the delicate new rhythm that had taken shape around Avery's recovery. Snow hadn't yet touched the hills outside the hospital, but the air had turned sharper, and the sun dipped lower in the sky with every passing day. Inside the walls of her private room, warmth had begun to replace the sterile stillness. There were drawings taped to the cabinets, little vases of dried flowers collected by Rose on her walks with Grayson, and books stacked in uneven piles on the windowsill. What had once been a space marked by uncertainty was now quietly transforming into something that resembled a home. Avery was growing stronger. Her hair had begun to return in soft, fine strands. Her voice, once raspy and frail, had taken on a familiar steadiness. She still had tired days, and some treatments left her pale and withdrawn, but she was different now, not just healthier, but more alive. The weight she had carried alone for years was now being lifted, piece by piece, by someone willing to carry it with her. One evening, as the shadows outside stretched long across the garden, Grayson found himself sitting across from Avery while Rose was in an art therapy session down the hall. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of Avery's pencil as she filled another page of her journal. Grayson was watching her, not with worry, but with wonder. It was still hard for him to reconcile the version of himself that had walked away from her with the man who now couldn't go a day without seeing her face. Without looking up, Avery said softly, "You watch me like you think I might disappear again." Grayson leaned forward, his voice equally quiet. "I don't think you'll disappear. I just don't want to miss anything anymore." She closed the journal and looked up at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "You're doing better than I thought you would. You used to hate sitting still." "I still do," he admitted. "But somehow, this doesn't feel like stillness. It feels like living." They were quiet for a moment, and then Avery reached under her blanket and pulled something from her nightstand. It was the heart-shaped pendant, the half she had worn for years, tucked away beneath shirts and hospital gowns, always close but never visible. She held it out to him, and for a second he didn't move. He could see the tiny scratch on the edge, the small dent near the clasp. He knew it by heart. When he took it from her, their fingers brushed. "I never stopped wearing it," she said. "Even after everything." Grayson looked down at it in his palm, then slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the other half, the one he had worn every day since the day he left her. He hadn't even known why back then. Only that something about it felt necessary, like a memory that refused to let go. He held both pieces together. They still fit. Perfectly. Without forcing. Without bending. "I always thought I broke us," he said quietly. "And maybe I did. But I never stopped hoping that some part of us had survived." Avery nodded. "I didn't need you to come back perfect. I just needed you to come back." They said nothing else that evening, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had rebuilt: trust, forgiveness, an unspoken promise that neither of them would disappear again. When Rose came bouncing in minutes later, covered in paint and holding a picture of 3 stick figures under a bright yellow sun, she proudly held it up and said, "This is us. Mommy, me, and Daddy." Avery and Grayson exchanged a glance, a quiet breath passing between them. Rose had never called him that before, not out loud, not directly. And yet she said it with such ease, as if the word had always belonged there. Grayson took the picture, smiled at her, and then at Avery. "You have your mom's eyes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And her heart." That night, when Grayson left the hospital, he didn't feel like a visitor. He felt like something more. Something permanent. And as the snow finally began to fall outside, dusting the roads in soft white, he understood that the pieces of his life, once broken, once scattered, were slowly, steadily finding their way back together. Spring came earlier than anyone expected. The hills beyond the hospital began to wake from their winter silence, dusted in soft green and speckled with wildflowers that seemed to appear overnight. Birds returned to the trees outside Avery's window, and Rose began spending longer hours outdoors, chasing butterflies and pressing blossoms into notebooks like little treasures. Inside the hospital, change was blooming too. Avery's blood work continued to improve, her energy slowly returned, and by early April, her doctors gave her the news she hadn't dared to hope for: remission. The cancer, for now, had retreated. Her body had fought, and it had survived. The room erupted into quiet celebration. Maggie cried first. Grayson held Avery's hand so tightly she winced, but she smiled through it, her eyes full of something deeper than joy, relief, perhaps, or the feeling of breathing without fear for the first time in years. 2 weeks later, Avery was discharged. The staff lined the hallway as she left the building in a soft cream sweater and jeans that hung slightly loose on her still recovering frame. Grayson was beside her, one hand gently on her back, the other clutching Rose's as they walked together through the sliding glass doors and into the sunlight. The world felt impossibly large, but not frightening. Not anymore. Grayson had already prepared everything. A guest suite in his home had been transformed into a sun-filled bedroom, warm and open with soft lighting and shelves filled with books Avery loved. Rose had her own room just down the hall, decorated with hand-drawn posters and strings of fairy lights, her name painted across the door. Avery resisted at first. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want to feel like a guest in a life she once left behind. But Grayson never treated her like a guest. He made space in every part of his routine, quietly adjusting his life without ceremony. He cooked breakfast with her in the mornings, sometimes burning the toast but learning to laugh at himself. He read to Rose before bed, always using the silly voices she requested. And when Avery couldn't sleep, he would sit beside her on the couch and listen to the soft hum of the city with her, neither of them speaking, simply existing in the comfort of shared quiet. One night, Rose fell asleep with both of them tucked on either side of her. She had insisted on a sleepover in the big bed, and neither Avery nor Grayson had argued. They lay there in the dark, Rose's soft breath steady between them, and Avery whispered, "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" Grayson turned to look at her, the glow of the streetlight outside casting a gentle shadow across her face. "I used to," he said. "But if they had, maybe I wouldn't have become the kind of man who deserved this second chance." She reached out across the space between them and laced her fingers with his. "You always did," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." In early summer, they had a small celebration in the garden behind Grayson's home. Just a few close friends and some of the hospital staff. There was no grand announcement, no speeches. Just music, soft laughter, a few candles, and the three of them under a tree that had begun to bloom with tiny white flowers. Rose ran barefoot through the grass, wearing a crown of daisies Avery had woven for her, and Grayson sat with Avery on a bench, his arm around her shoulder, both of them watching as their daughter spun in circles, carefree and whole. Later that evening, Grayson knelt in front of Avery as the sky faded from blue to lavender. He didn't have a ring in his pocket. He didn't have a script. But he did have everything he had never said. He took her hands in his, kissed her knuckles, and simply said, "I want to grow old beside you. Whatever that looks like. I want to be the man who walks with you through everything, not just the hard parts. Say yes, Avery. Say yes to us." Her eyes shimmered, and for once she didn't hold back the tears. She leaned forward, touched her forehead to his, and whispered, "I already have." They didn't need an aisle or a ceremony that day. They had something more sacred, redemption, healing, love rebuilt from silence and scars. And as the night drew in around them, their hearts, once broken in separate halves, beat together as one. Rose curled into Avery's lap beneath the stars and said, as if it had always been true, "We're a family now." And she was right. They were. Not perfect. Not without history. But whole. Finally, undeniably whole. The ending of this story is deeply human, and that's where its beauty lies. It doesn't chase perfection or wrap everything in a neat fairy tale. Instead, it honors the quiet strength it takes to rebuild something that was once broken, whether it's trust, family, or one's sense of self. Grayson's journey isn't about redemption through grand gestures, but through showing up every day, staying when it's hard, and listening when words fall short. Avery's healing isn't just physical, it's emotional, spiritual, and earned through her refusal to let pain turn into bitterness. What I love most about this ending is its restraint. It doesn't promise that everything will always be easy. It just promises that they'll face it together. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of happy ending, the one where two people choose each other, not because they forgot the past, but because they've finally made peace with it. It's a reminder that family isn't defined by timing or perfection or even biology. It's defined by choice. And in the final quiet moment beneath the stars, when Rose says, "We're a family now," you believe her. Because after everything, they are.